So one of the most memorable calls of my entire career as a police officer happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, right around the time all the school buses were out on the roads. That time of the morning is probably one of the least busy of our day, where the worst that you'll get is a minor accident or a bad case of road rage. But that morning was different. So my partner and I got a call from dispatch, asking us to perform a welfare check on an address nearby because they'd gotten a silent 911 call. And the call was silent, and then the caller hung up. But after dispatch called back, whoever answered very sketchily changed their story from, "I didn't call 911, to, "Oh, I must have dialed it accidentally. No need to send anyone out." Now, on paper, you might think, okay, accidents happen, right? No harm, no foul. Well, that's not how things work in practice. We try to follow up on every 911 that you might describe as inconclusive, and the reasons for that will become obvious as this story unfolds. And so we drove over to the address that the call came from, arriving at around 8:15 and knocked on the door. A man in his late 40s to early 50s came to the door and once again assured us that his call had been accidental. We asked if we could come inside to take a look around, and he said, "Sure, no problem." The first floor was a mess, but there was otherwise nothing suspicious about it, and the same applied to the second. But when we asked if we could take a look in the guy's basement, he suddenly went from being friendly and inviting to acting extremely suspicious. The second my partner took a step towards the basement door, the guy got very nervous and said something like, "I'd rather you just didn't go down there. It's a real mess and it's very embarrassing for me." And this was after allowing us to walk around a home that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. And so as you can imagine, me and my partner's spidey senses were starting to tingle. And we didn't have a warrant, so we couldn't exactly force our way in there. But when we told him that we would come back with a warrant, he just said, "Fine, go get your warrant, but for now I'd just like both of you to leave." Now we did as he asked, thanked him for his time, and then walked back to our squad car, fully intent on reporting what we'd found so the department could apply for a warrant. And then right as we were about to drive off, I spotted something near one of the guy's basement windows. It looked like roots flapping in the breeze at first, but there was something off about the way they moved. They weren't moving with the breeze, they were sort of moving on their own accord, flapping up and down and up and down. And I remember sort of squinting at them and thinking, what the hell? When it suddenly hit me what I was looking at. They weren't dry roots. They were fingers. Human fingers. I remember telling my partner that there was someone in the basement. Now he's like, huh? Because obviously he had no idea how I'd figured it out, but following my lead as I got out of the car and marched right back up to the guy's door again. The fingers were gone from the basement window when I tried to show him, but he trusted that I hadn't just hallucinated the whole thing and joined me at the guy's door when I knocked a second time. Now the guy came to the door saying, "I thought I told you two to get lost." Now he didn't open the door. He talked through it, which I guess was a smart move considering the circumstances. He just wasn't smart enough. I told the guy that we'd stay out of his property, but we just had an issue with one of our sergeants who didn't believe the 911 call had been accidental. He could either call the department, which might involve being put on hold for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, or he could walk to our squad car and talk to the sergeant on our radio, which would take no more than around 60 seconds. Now I laid it on thick, like we were sorry, like we might even be in trouble for bothering him, and he bought it hook, line, and sinker though. And then when he stepped out of his house and closed the door behind him, we pounced. We easily took the guy to the ground, then after putting him in cuffs with my partner standing guard over him, I entered the house, starting to clear it and made my way to the basement. It was locked, but with the whole place rotting from the inside out, it only took a couple of kicks before those hinges gave way and I was able to sort of wench my way through the door panel. Flicking the light switch did nothing, so I flicked on the flashlight attachment on my pistol and crept into the dark, calling out police department. Then as I listened, I heard this muffled groaning coming from what looked like a closet. The door was padlocked, so I had to search through piles of debris and rusty tools before I found anything that could clip it off. But when I did, and I opened the door, I was greeted by a cage, and inside it was a young woman who had some kind of mask attached to the lower half of her face. She burst into tears when she saw that it was a cop opening the door and not her captor. And then after I removed the mask, which doubled as a kind of gag, she kept saying thank you, thank you, thank you through her tears. It turned out it was the guy's niece, who had been sent to live with him by her parents after a period of very unruly behavior, quote unquote. He'd built the cage and closet right next to the basement door, and at first we figured it was for light and air, but the point was to taunt her with a view of the outside world that was too high for her to reach. But then how did she stick her fingers out the window, I'm probably hearing you ask. Well, through weeks of practice, that's how. She had calluses on her feet from scrambling up the rough, uneven stone wall, and she said it hurt at first, but she couldn't even make it a few feet. But with practice came calluses, and those calluses made it so she could scramble all the way up the wall before grabbing onto the ledge. She said she broke the window late one night after climbing up the wall, and when her uncle wanted to know where all the blood had come from, as she cut her fingers up something awful, she lied and said that she got her period. Now, being an almost perfect Mormon, the guy believed her and didn't even think to check her for any actual wounds. And after that, it just became a case of waiting for the right moment to signal visitors. And there was no calling out to them because the guy had learned pretty quickly that if he didn't want to get caught, he'd have to gag her and silence her. But that meant that we were the third set of visitors he tried to signal, and after failing with the first two, she was just about ready to give up. It was only when she heard my partner say, "My name is Officer such and such," that she realized that the cops were there. At which point she started scrambling and signaling like crazy in the hopes that we'd spot her. And then by some miracle, we did. Now, I'd like to say that there was some grand happy ending to this whole story, that the girl was returned to her family and the guy went to prison for 100,000 million years. But all I know is that the girl was not returned to her family, who were deemed unfit to take care of her, and she ended up in the foster care system for a couple of years. The guy who kept her prisoner in her basement ended up going away for probably 15 years, which is undeniably a good thing. But I sometimes get the feeling that some punishments just don't fit the crime. That girl is filled with the memories of her captivity and abuse for the rest of her life, while her sick psycho uncle is going to be out in less than 10 years if he even behaves himself while he's inside. She might never get to the point of leading a normal life. Those scars will always be with her, visible or not. But that guy spent some time and money building a cage in his basement so he could live out some gross power fantasy with his own flesh and blood. At this point, I'd be more surprised if he didn't do it again. But I also take comfort in the idea that if he does, there will be some very focused-eyed officer, much like myself, to bring him to justice all over again. I work for the UK's National Crime Agency, and for 6 years of that, I worked with its missing persons unit. I actually really enjoyed my time with the unit. It was good, clean detective work that made a real difference to people's lives. The success rate was fantastic too, and the vast majority of cases I dealt with ended with the missing person being found and brought home. But every so often, a case would take you to some very dark places. In the UK, if a person who's been reported missing doesn't return within 3 days, their name is fed into the NCA's Missing Persons Unit. I'd like to say that we get around looking for those people right away, but there tends to be something of a backlog to work through. So the file of the girl named Melissa, not her real name, had been sitting on my desk for just over a week before I got around to it. According to the report of the IIO, that's the Initial Investigating Officer, it was Melissa's mom that had reported her missing. Her daughter lived near Brighton with a friend-turned-flatmate, but when both suddenly stopped answering their phones, she started to worry. When the IIO called over to the semi-detached Melissa and her housemate shared, no one came to the door. But after talking to a neighbor, he learned both Melissa and her flatmate had been seen recently, and nothing appeared amiss with either of them. Now, this was encouraging, but not conclusive, so I drove over to the address in the hopes of closing the case that day. The house in question was a lovely little place, with a small front garden and nice flower beds. After I rang the doorbell, a young woman opened the door, early 20s, petite, with sandy blonde hair and a big smile. She introduced herself as Helen, also not her real name, and as Melissa's housemate, who was only too happy to explain the situation. I was told Melissa had taken ill and was upstairs in bed. Helen, on the other hand, had been so rushed off her feet having to work and take care of her that she'd missed her mum's calls and forgotten to return them. And she seemed terribly sorry to worry everyone, but both she and Melissa were fine and were in no need of assistance. It sounded like a convincing story. She didn't appear to be hiding anything anyway. But we can't just take people's word for it when it comes to missing persons investigations. A case can't be closed until we either make face-to-face contact or are given irrefutable proof-of-life images, such as those from high-definition time-stamped CCTV. So in light of that, I asked Helen if I could come inside so I could at least lay eyes on Melissa. And after Helen invited me inside, she asked me to wait in the hallway for a moment while she went and fetched something from the kitchen. And when she returned, she was carrying a tray with a bowl of soup on it and said that I was just in time for lunch. Now, the sight of the tray and the soup suggested Helen was too sick to get out of bed, so I asked what was troubling her. And Helen said that she thought that it was a viral thing that had really run her batteries down, so to speak, and so she just needed some bed rest. Helen added that Melissa had improved an awful lot over the past few days, but was still a bit too poorly to be going up and down stairs. I promised I wouldn't stay more than a minute or two, and I was relieved that she was safe and at least partially sound. But after Helen opened Melissa's bedroom door and I followed her inside, I found something very different to what had been described. Melissa was indeed right there, lying in bed in front of me, but it was clear that she'd been deceased for some time. Exactly how long was difficult to say, as it appeared Helen had been applying some kind of moisturizer or cream to Melissa's face. Her clothes appeared clean, meaning Helen was frequently changing them, because after she set down the tray and tried feeding Melissa a spoonful of what I think was chicken soup, it sort of just dribbled out of her mouth and onto the neck of the t-shirt she was wearing. It was a scene that, even thinking about it all these years later, makes the hairs on my arms and neck stand on end. But Helen acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. She said sweet, encouraging things to Melissa as she attempted to feed her, almost like the way a person talks to a child. When the soup sort of dribbled out of her mouth, she said something like, "Oh dear, making a mess again. But don't you worry, I'll get that cleaned up for you." Now, I've never seen anything that was so frightening, disturbing, and upsetting all at once, not in all of my time in the police. And so, and I'm ashamed to say, but all I could do for a minute or so was just sort of stand there, gawping and trying to work out what was going on. Seeing Helen revert to trying to feed a lifeless Melissa sort of jolted me back into my body, and then in the politest way possible, I asked if I might speak with her outside for a moment. She said yes, but only for a moment because she didn't want Melissa's soup getting cold. Outside in the corridor, I did something that I'd done only once or twice per year and told a person I believed their loved one was deceased. Now, on every other occasion, this was greeted with either tears of grief or a grim sort of acceptance, but on this occasion, Helen looked at me like I'd grown a second head. She understood Melissa was looking a bit worse for wear, but she wasn't dead. In fact, she'd most likely just be up and about again over the next couple of days. I assured her, in the most tender manner I could muster, that was not going to be the case, and then reminded her that denial, a perfectly normal part of the grieving process, could be a very powerful thing when left unchecked. After that last part, I saw the briefest flicker of understanding in her eyes, and then it was gone. And after excusing herself, she tried walking back into the bedroom before the soup got cold. When she turned back, I informed her with just a smidge of sternness how what she was doing was against the law. Unless she surrendered Melissa's body to the relevant authorities, she would be arrested and charged. And when I said that, she turned nasty. She spun around, and with this look of anger and outrage on her face, asked if I was really going to arrest her for taking care of her friend. I reminded her that, as hard as it was to accept, that wasn't what she was doing. When she pointed towards the stairs and told me to see myself out, I asked her not to make things any worse than they already were. Again, there was this brief moment where it looked like I was getting through to her, and then she flipped. Her eyes went all wide, and she started screeching at me to get the hell out of her house, and then seeing as I didn't want to aggravate her any further, I immediately began walking toward the stairs while saying, Okay, Helen, I'm leaving. But as I walked, I made one near fatal mistake and pulled my mobile phone out. She knew what that meant, and after lunging at me in a way I never expected, she slapped the phone out of my hands and it went tumbling down the stairs. I asked her to calm down as I walked down after my phone, but Helen screamed something about me trying to take her away. And then what I also didn't anticipate in the slightest was Helen launching herself down the stairs and onto my back so hard it sent us both crashing down the last few steps. The landing so thoroughly knocked the wind out of me that I was convinced that I must have broken a rib and maybe even punctured a lung. I could barely move for a second, but then feeling Helen's fingers reaching from my face, and more specifically my eye, spurred me into action. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it was some epic struggle. I was a 5'11" ex-rugby player, and she couldn't have been any taller than 5'4", but unleashing that kind of force on someone that I knew was just out of their mind with grief, that made for a struggle all of its own. Restraining her did no good at first, and Helen kept on trying to fight me, and it was only when I mentioned Melissa's family that I saw that flicker of understanding reappear in her eye. But that time, it didn't go away. It stayed, and after she suddenly stopped struggling, Helen burst into tears. I promised that I'd get her help, and I did, although it wasn't until uniformed officers turned up that I learned that I had 3 deep scratches on my face running away from my right eye. Helen was taken away first, then Melissa, and then after that I went back to the office to contact Melissa's mom and close the case. Helen was charged with assault on a police officer and preventing the lawful burial of a dead body. She pled guilty to both charges and received a very lenient suspended sentence due to her fragile state of mind at the time of the incident. Helen later wrote to me, apologizing for what happened. I offered my complete and unreserved forgiveness and told her that it was all part of the job. I didn't join the NCA because it'd be an easy ride. I joined because it meant doing difficult things to help people through the hardest and darkest of times. The Kyoto Hattori case centers on a shocking attack that unfolded in Tokyo on Halloween night, turning what should have been a night of celebration into chaos and fear. Dressed in a costume that eerily mirrored a comic book villain, Hattori's actions stunned the nation and raised unsettling questions about motive, isolation, and the darkness that can hide behind an ordinary smile. Check out the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. I was a negotiator for more than 2 decades, and as you can imagine, I saw my fair share of messed up situations and even more messed up endings to these said situations. But out of all of them, this is the one that springs to mind whenever someone asks which are the most memorable. Now, one night, I got a call about a barricaded suspect in a downtown apartment building. The guy was armed, and he'd already shot at the cops once already, and he was threatening to set the whole building on fire if anyone tried to break down his door. I jumped in my car and drove downtown. Then when I arrived at the apartment building, 2 cops guided me to the elevator and up to the floor of the barricaded apartment. After 20 years in this line of work, I've learned that being a police negotiator really isn't about talking, it's about listening. Everyone imagines it's all smooth words and quick thinking, but the truth is, the best negotiators are patient, quiet, and calm when everyone else is losing it. You spend most of your time trying to understand what brought someone to that breaking point, because there's always a story behind the gun, behind the barricade, behind the threat. And in this case, our suspect had just sort of snapped. He was a recently released felon who had been working a job program, and from what I could gather, he clearly hadn't been ready to rejoin society. He said his boss just kept talking to him like he was lesser than, so he smacked him around a little before quitting. The cops then went to his door to cart him off to jail, and that's when he opened fire on them through the door with what the officers said was a large caliber semi-automatic rifle. And when I asked him what he wanted, he said that he wanted to leave the country. He'd rather die than go back to prison. He hated America, and he'd rather be a gringo with no español than go back to wearing prison blue. I tried telling him that that wasn't going to happen, that the only way out was to stay within the realm of realistic options, and he replied that his position hadn't changed, and if we broke down that door, the building was going to go up in flames. Over the next hour or so, I just kept on trying to reason with him by shouting down a short corridor. Not the most ideal way of communicating, but it was effective enough for me to determine that our perp wasn't alone in his apartment. Oh no, his mother was in there too. And once we realized that, the situation changed radically. It was no longer about getting our perp out of his apartment, it was about getting his mom out so SWAT could do their job without getting her hurt. But when I suggested that he allow her to leave, and owing to his belief that we'd somehow hurt her, the perp refused to allow his mom a way out. She hadn't spoken much during the standoff. I mean, so much so we didn't even realize that she was in there till she finally spoke up. But when her son refused to let her leave, she got very vocal in trying to persuade him otherwise. Being very much on our side, she kept telling her son to do the right thing and give himself up, or if he wasn't going to surrender, he should at least let her leave because no mother should have to watch their son die in front of their eyes. You might think that this was something I appreciated, having someone on the inside to wear him down psychologically. In reality, I had the complete opposite reaction. It sounds crazy to say it, but by the time she was bringing up the prospect of imminent death, I actually appreciated the perp telling her to shut the F up. I didn't say it out loud, you don't ever want to say anything overtly negative, but as a negotiator you want to keep your perp calm, but above all, you want to keep them hopeful. Sometimes I think the most effective words in my arsenal are, "No one has to die here today," because it gives a perp hope. So when his own mother announced her belief that he wasn't long for this world, I don't think a single other sentence could have caused him more agitation. I tried saying, "Your mom's going to be fine, and so are you," but he wasn't even listening to me anymore. He was focused entirely on his mom as she talked about how she might die and how he might die and how they'd see it. I called out those 7 words, "No one has to die here today," but on that occasion, they didn't even make a dent in the screaming and shouting that came from the other side of the door, which got louder and louder before bang, bang, bang. There was this dead silence for a couple of seconds, and at first I thought that the shots might have been directed at us through the apartment door. Turns out they weren't fired at us, but we didn't figure out who exactly the perp was aiming at until we heard him whimpering, "What have I done? What have I done?" And that night was the only time in my whole career, my whole life in fact, that I ever asked another man, "Did you just shoot your mom?" Then a second later, we all heard this very tearful, strained reply of, "Yeah, I shot her." And the cops behind me couldn't believe it, and neither could I till I had heard how cracked his voice was and how silent she was. And call me cold-hearted, but all I remember thinking was, work the angle. And I know it must sound harsh, but I was in work mode, and if I did my job well, then lives might have been saved, and that's all I could focus on. I told the perp if he tossed his gun out into the corridor, we could get EMTs into his apartment to help his mother, but once again, he was barely listening. He just kept yelling, "Mom, Mom, wake up," and it took quite an effort to drag his attention away from that. But even after offering him help for his mother, the guy still wouldn't surrender, and he'd yell stuff through the tears about his right to defend himself and his family. And I tried my best to get those EMTs into that apartment, but when it came down to brass tacks, the perp cared more about keeping his ass out of prison than saving her life. And then, not long after, he started yelling about how she was dead. And I knew he was telling the truth. I could hear it in his voice. But like I said, it was up to me to keep him hopeful. I yelled back that he didn't know that she was dead, that her pulse might just be weak and her breathing might be very shallow too. He replied that he'd been checking her pulse for the last 5 minutes, She was dead and he knew it. After a tap on the shoulder from one of the SWAT guys, I got to work trying to distract him. I started asking him if he was still wanting a car and a plane ticket to Mexico, and when he said he did, but didn't believe that we'd ever deliver them, I told him that we were already arranging it. We didn't want anyone else to die, and as far as we cared, he was Mexico's problem now. He called the BS, and rightfully so, but repetition, as they say, is the mother of all learning, and I kept on saying it over and over, fitting it into any place I could. I tell him how that car was on the way and how we could get him on a commercial flight that very same night, no questions asked. He could even keep hold of his gun if he wanted to. He just had to promise not to fire at police after we backed away from the parking lot. Now, much like yourself, our perp was calling BS, saying the cops would never just give someone a car and a plane ticket, and I said that if he didn't believe me, he could look out into the parking lot and see for himself, because there was a navy blue Bronco gassed up and ready to drive. And there was a moment of near silence as I heard the perp's footsteps on the other side of the door. And then all of a sudden, there was a bang, followed by a smash of glass, and the thud of a limp body hitting the floor. When a perp executes a hostage or otherwise poses a serious and imminent threat to innocent life, the game changes completely. We go from trying to preserve all human life, including the hostage taker, to doing our damnedest to prevent him from doing any additional harm. That meant, from the moment that SWAT guy tapped me on the shoulder and whispered that they had a police sniper in position, I had one job, and one job only: get the perp to look out the window. Those are by far the worst kind of jobs, when you walk away feeling like the goddamn Grim Reaper, having just talked a man into his death. The only thing that keeps you sane is knowing that doing so prevents others from suffering identical fates. When I was just 2 years into policing, and I was still a fairly inexperienced beat cop, my partner and I were out on patrol one day when we got a call from dispatch. An arrest warrant had been issued for a guy who'd failed to keep up with child support payments, and a judge determined that he was hiding assets. We used to deal with stuff like that from time to time. Random dads trying to beat the system, sometimes addicts who barely even remember that they had kids. And neither group tended to be fans of the cops, so their greetings were usually pretty frosty. But after rolling up on our delinquent washing his car outside his apartment building, he was actually pretty chill at first. After we confirmed who he was, and he was perfectly polite and civil, the guy then says, "Ah, man, the lady at the courthouse said this might happen." Now my partner asked what he meant by that, and the guy said that he knew exactly why we were there. He admitted that he hadn't paid his child support on time, but had driven over to the county courthouse just 2 days prior to pay off the outstanding balance. Because it was past the deadline, the lady said an arrest warrant might already be in the process of being issued, but if that happened, he could ask the arresting officers to contact the courthouse, and they'd confirm that it had been issued in error. Now, Joe Sixpack is probably going to read this and think, what the hell, criminals can just do that? Claim that there's a mistake and make the cops contact the damn judge? Well, yes and no. If we get a call about an escaped axe murderer, it's much more of a ask no questions type situation. But then when it comes to stuff like issues of custody or child support payments, things get way, way more complicated. Then if we arrest someone in error, even if all we can see in front of us is what appears to be a bona fide warrant, they can be entitled to a big chunk of change that comes right out of our budget. Seeing as we don't want to rack up some huge bills and compensation, we're advised to use our own judgment. And in that case, since nothing about the guy was screaming a-hole, my partner contacted our precinct to ask if someone could double-check the warrant. And after that came the waiting game. It's something you get accustomed to pretty quickly as a police officer, all that hurry up and wait stuff. We wait for backup, we wait for SWAT, we wait for clearance, or we wait for negotiators, and sometimes we wait for warrants to be confirmed. And to kill time, we often explain the situation as best as we can to whoever's name is on the warrant, or if we're in our squad car, we'll just shoot the breeze on this or that till word comes back. But then sometimes, making small talk with a perp is a real leveler in terms of showing him you're just a regular person doing a kind of irregular kind of job. And that can sometimes be the difference between a good day and a really, really bad one. And so, because we needed to detain the guy in the event that his warrant was good, we walked him over to our squad car and sat him in the back while we stood near the open door. And since he was being so friendly, we didn't cuff him. We didn't search him either. We didn't think we needed to. My partner asked him if he watched the Falcons, and when the guy said yeah, they started discussing if Mike Smith was the right coach for the job since they'd just been demolished 24-2 by the Giants, etc., and the guy in the back of the squad was saying something like, hell no. But then my partner started saying how Smith was a rebuild coach and that we were really just trying to improve and not to win. By the end of his little speech, the guy in the back then says, yeah, I feel you. And my partner was kind of proven right too, because 2012 saw the Falcons edge a 30-28 victory in the divisional playoffs. They ended up losing the NFC Championship to the Niners, but that's whatever, I guess. Because my partner wouldn't live to see it. After a couple of more minutes of talking amongst ourselves, my partner's radio starts buzzing with news from dispatch. This is another thing that really sets us apart from civilians, well, most civilians anyway, and that only those with an ear for it can really decipher what's being said over police radios. This meant that I heard it loud and clear when dispatch confirmed the warrant was good and we were to bring this guy in. But our perp didn't understand a word, so when my partner tells him to step out of the car so we can put the cuffs on him, his face just sort of drops. He goes from the nicest, friendliest, most reasonable guy you could ever hope to meet, and he turns, like a werewolf, right in front of my eyes. His smile disappeared, his brow dropped, and as my partner reached into the squad car to offer him a hand, our perp reached into his pants. By the time my partner saw the gun, it was too late. He knew what was happening and what a terrible mistake we'd both made, but by the time his hand touched his holster, almost a dozen shots had been fired at him point blank. The coroner's report said it only took minutes for him to bleed to death from massive internal injuries, but having seen it myself, I think he was dead before he even hit the floor. People who are shot that many times, they gurgle or groan while they writhe around for a while, and then suddenly they're just gone. But my partner just laid there like he was sleeping till they carried him off to the cooling board. The guy in the back, the one who pulled the gun and shot him, his departure from this mortal plane wasn't nearly so peaceful. I emptied a whole mag through the back window. And then after I reloaded and he made the mistake of trying to get out of the car, I emptied a whole nother mag through the broken glass until we finally stopped moving. I heard him gurgling, I heard him groaning, and all I could think in the moment was, what's waiting for you downstairs is going to make those bullet holes feel like tickles from a feather. And I'm glad he was suffering. I wanted him to. And aside from not searching the guy or putting him in cuffs, my only regret is not making him suffer even more before he finally stopped moving and stopped making noises. The funeral was rough. Almost the whole department turned out to see him off, and my partner's whole family were just so darned understanding. We all felt this huge amount of guilt for letting something like that creep up on us because it wasn't us that paid, it was him. But during the eulogy, my partner's brother said that he was proud, because although we lost him, my partner went out dragging a little piece of evil with him too. And that's why he served, so he died doing what he loved, trying to keep ordinary people safe. In my entire career as a police officer, one of the most haunting things I ever witnessed started as a very basic welfare check. I was out in my squad car when a call came over the radio saying some sweet old lady hadn't been seen for a while, and so I volunteered myself to check out the address in question and then drove over and parked outside. No one came to the door when I rang the doorbell, and then, since there was a heck of a lot of mail piling up inside the contained porch area, I knew that I'd have to force entry to ensure that this woman was okay. Now, I wasn't expecting anything as such because as a cop you learn to expect the unexpected. I performed an almost identical welfare check on a lady whose hearing aid had run out of battery. I almost scared her half to death when I just sort of appeared there in her kitchen all of a sudden. But bottom line, she was okay, and the lady on this occasion, however, was not. I managed to break the lock on the double doors around the back of her house, and then I was in. And right away, I was greeted by the smell of death. It wasn't strong, which suggested the lady that I was looking for hadn't been dead for very long, but when I found her, her general condition confirmed this. But what I also noticed was that her arms and hands appeared to be in a much more enhanced state of decomposition. There were large patches of skin and flesh missing from them, mostly in circular patterns, while the skin on her face and legs were dry and waxy but mostly undegraded. I looked around the room for any clue as to why this was the case. For example, if there were any hazardous chemicals or biohazards that might account for the strange rate of decomposition, but there was nothing. And aside from the corpse lying in the middle of it, the room looked totally unremarkable. I radioed in the body, then got an almost instant response to say support was inbound. But literally seconds after I acknowledged, I heard this soft mewling sound coming from what sounded like the second floor. I turned in time to see a black cat walking into the room. It stopped when it saw me and sat still looking at me for a second. My heart sank when I saw it, and I remember saying something like, "Hey buddy, I'm real sorry about your mom." And it was a dumb thing to say, I know, but it was almost like more for me than the cat. I still hadn't put two and two together, and yet I didn't want to scare the cat at all in case it tried attacking me, as cats are worse than dogs for that sometimes for sure, and so I gave it a wide berth as I made my way back towards the back doors. But when I got there, and I looked back at the cat one last time, I saw it walking over towards the corpse of its owner, and then everything finally made sense. I remember just thinking, or sort of staring for a couple of seconds and thinking, "Oh God, please no. Please don't let it be the cat." But it was. And as to dispel any reasonable doubt that I had left, the cat stopped, sat itself down, and then just started chewing and tearing at the skin of its owner's arm. I didn't entirely see it. The cat had its back to me, but I heard it, and that was enough to send me out the back doors and back towards my squad car. I'd heard a lot of rumors about pets eating their owners following sudden and unexpected deaths, but I'd never seen it for myself until then. I only ever saw it the one time too, but it's something that I'll never, ever forget. So, picture the scene. It's the middle of a cold and rainy night in the windy city, and my partner and I are cruising along in our patrol car waiting for the next call to come. It's been a real boring night so far, so we were practically begging for something interesting to happen. But as the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. When the call came, it was from a woman saying her boyfriend was drunk and he was getting physical with her. And to be brutally honest with you, both me and my partner were just thinking, jackpot. We switched on the cherries and berries, as they say, then put the pedal to the metal, because few things are as satisfying as carting some wife-beating sack of crap off to jail for a night. And it's not that we get to give him a few compliance strikes on the way out either, although this is a perk of the job. It's the fact that having him in a cell for a night can be just enough time for a battered spouse to get the hell out of Dodge. And we arrived at the address a few minutes later. It was an apartment building, but a resident let us inside and told us the apartment that we wanted was on that third floor. We go upstairs, found the right numbered apartment, and then banged on the door while yelling "Police Department." We could hear two people fighting on the inside, but after hearing me shout, we heard a man's voice calling out that everything was okay now and that they didn't need the cops anymore. Now, we more or less called bullcrap and then asked the guy to bring him and his girlfriend to the door so we can see that they're okay. There's a moment of silence, and then we suddenly hear movement, and then a female voice calls out, "Help! He's stabbing me, help!" Now, seeing as I was the larger and heavier of the two of us, I took a few steps back and got ready to kick the door open. It took 3 solid kicks before it started to give, and then on the 4th, it swung open, and my partner was the first through the door. I followed close behind, gun drawn and held out in front of me, and after making it down a short hallway and turning a corner into the kitchen, we saw a woman with blood all over her and a man holding a knife. My partner shouted for him to drop it, but he didn't even finish issuing his command before the guy fled down another hallway leading away from the kitchen, still holding that knife. We told the wounded lady to stay put and not to move. Then after quickly requesting medical units, we followed the guy down the hallway. We thought we had him trapped. We thought we had the upper hand, but we were wrong. And I'll never forget how physical the sensation of my heart dropping was when I heard the cries of a young child coming from what was clearly a back bedroom. We had no idea that there was a kid in the apartment, and knowing that there was one present changed everything, especially once we saw our perp darting out of the bedroom with a screaming kid under his arm. He only came in and out of view for about a second, like a flash of movement, and then he was in cover again. And then the sound of the little boy screaming was joined by the sounds of me and my partner yelling at the guy to drop him. We didn't stop. We couldn't. The guy had a knife and now he had a kid in his arm. So we kept on pushing down the narrow hallway till we reached the end of it and saw the guy with the knife raised above his head. He was threatening to stab the kid unless we backed off, but obviously we weren't about to do that. Instead, we yelled at him a few more times to drop the knife, watching where his eyes went until they finally landed back on the kid. He tensed up and brought the knife a little higher, clearly about to bring that blade straight down onto the kid's head. So my partner did what he'd been trained to do and attempted to neutralize the threat. We're trained to shoot until that's the case. You don't shoot someone once and then hope that they're not going to get back up and go for their weapon. If they present a threat to life, you shoot till they're not moving anymore. Another reason that we're trained to do this is because in that kind of high-pressure situation where adrenaline is pumping, just one shot might do absolutely nothing. In the movies, people get shot and they spin around or fly across the room. And while the latter might certainly be true with a close-range shotgun blast, a 9mm bullet is a very different situation. So when my partner opened up on the guy with the knife, the shots didn't send him flying across the room or spin him around and knock him off his feet. But he felt them all right, and he chose to put the closest thing he could between himself and the bullets, which was the kid standing at his feet. And it was all over in a matter of 2 or 3 seconds, just a pop, 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 pop. And then both man and boy were on the ground laying still. We hoped all the bullets might have missed the kid, and that all of the shots hit nothing but the guy, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And what followed was like something out of a living nightmare, a reality we just didn't want to accept. My partner started to gag, then ran to the bathroom to puke. All I could do was call in what had happened and then stand there, shell-shocked till backup showed up. Our sergeant was one of the first to arrive, and he took my partner out to his car to calm him down. He later said that he thought my partner was going to eat his gun. He was in that bad of a state. And the sergeant kept asking him what happened, but he couldn't say. And then when he finally found the words, he could only whisper it, and he couldn't bring himself to say it any louder than that. The EMTs rushed the lady with the stab wounds to the hospital, and they were able to stop the bleeding and save her life. But the kid and the knife wielder were both pronounced dead at the scene. It was tough to stomach, and it took me a long time before I stopped thinking about it and dreaming about it. But what happened that night destroyed my partner in more ways than one. He quit the force not long after and then ended up moving out of state. He wanted to be as far as possible from the biggest mistake of his life, and no matter how much support and counseling we could offer him, he knew the best thing for him was to just leave. And when you sign up to be a cop, the thought of dying on the job most definitely enters your head at some point. But what no one ever tells you is there are mental casualties too, not just physical ones. And when you lose someone that way, when they're still alive, just not there anymore, it hurts almost as much as when you lost them, for real. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of this YouTube channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, faces are best eaten medium rare.